right, let's talk about that Geelong versus Brisbane game, and it was an absolute cracker last night that you could make an argument in a season with a number of thrillers. This was the best for the year, Jimmy, and it was all set up after the first quarter. The first 19 minutes, there was no goals, and then it was a goal fest, back and forth. The margin got out to 25 points, and in the end, the Lions make their second grand final in 2 years.
Yeah, you're right, Tom, and I was like Leigh, it was a seesawing affair, and every time you thought a team, OK, there you go, they're away, a couple more goals. The response from each other and each other's side was massive. We thought that was the big moment. Tom Stewart goes down the end, Henry kicks the goal, even though it only puts him a point up, and still plenty of time, he thought, OK, the Cats are going to go away with it. Yeah. And then that Archie snap, it's so underestimated how great a goal that was. He's come off no steps, really, powered it around the corner. Cam Rayner, pick number one, just pays for himself, really, doesn't he? Left foot on the run, dead centre. And then this from Payne, who we know has been battling the knee injury, just to have that energy that late in the game, run down tackle. And Reece Stanley, he pulled up a bit ginger, but thumped it into the goalpost, and it really sort of snuffed out any chance for the Cats to get home.
That was the last 5 minutes. Yeah. The previous 100 minutes was about the same. There was ebbing and flowing. Obviously, Geelong got 25 points in front when they kicked that first goal of the third quarter. And all of a sudden, you sort of thought at the time, this is really going to test the Lions. Are they going to lose it a little bit? Because 25 points is a reasonable margin, but they dug in and they kicked the next few goals, got back in front at three-quarter time, and then the last quarter, whole quarter just ebbed and flowed. Just incredible entertainment.
Awesome to watch. This is why we love footy. And the maturity of the Lions, Leigh, is something you want to speak about as well. They've had 6 games this year decided by a goal or less, 3 games decided by 1 point or less. The other was a draw. They've got practice in these moments.
Yeah, it is. And it's sort of like it is practice, and that's a good point, or the experience of it. I mean, late in the year, they actually were starting terrific and fading in the last quarters. Well, the last 2 weeks, they've come from behind. Not so good early, but really, really good late. But just to be able to hang in there and be in front on the siren, I know you could talk about scenario training and all those kind of things, but I think it's players on the field being composed enough under pressure compared to the opposition to do it just that little bit better under that spotlight.
I love the attitude from the Lions, and often when you're down, you think you're real tough language and that, but I heard Harris Andrews during the week, and I saw on their banner this quote that they've been using: if you're on thin ice, you might as well dance. And you get that sense with Brisbane. When their back's against the wall, they actually take a lot more risk and play with a lot more freedom, and they don't shy away from the big moments. And we've just picked up some stats here to highlight the ball movement in particular. The willingness to play, run, overlap. They tried to do it early in the game, but it was more slower, kick mark, but they created this overlap from the half-back line. Some defenders got on top, which we'll touch on in a second. But have a look at the difference from first half to second half, and I think it really opened up the Cats. They got better looks. Ryan Lester was absolutely magnificent. But look at this run and carry, even through the middle of the ground. There's this constant movement. Players aren't living back. That ball is on the boundary line, but just keep playing on. Something might happen. It forces the Cats to roll up. Look, the Cats are always scrambling here in defence. The usual outside cover is pulled apart because they kick on the 45. And look at some of the looks they were getting, especially in the second half. But you add on top of the pressure as well. Just this relentless go back to the ball and contest. Good things happen. Their inside forward 50 tackle pressure was amazing. Kai Lohmann, I don't think he's ever worried about the big moment. Leigh's man, of course. But look at the run from behind. Started from the back pocket. They're still moving. And again, take the corridor, look at it. Bailey, his work rate in the second half. A magnificent kick. That was absolutely laser-like. And it just created so many good things. Their willingness to dance if you're on thin ice.
Yeah. And I bet that their back third started off a lot of the time. I mean, the inside 50s field position were fairly similar. But in that third quarter, when they had the lead, Geelong, but the Lions were starting to come, a few times Geelong went through the middle of the ground, kicked it straight to the Lions defender. Now, when this is like an uncontested mark, well, then everything's opened up and the Lions got back through the centre square. That's a critical factor, isn't it? If you want to score quickly and heavily, you've got to get through the middle, take the punt to get through the centre square. And the Geelong defence just sort of kind of really was exposed because of that quick rebound.
And the number one player rated on the field in the last quarter was Ryan Lester, who's among a back line that has performed exceptionally well.
I've spoken to him about a couple of times, the late mature. He's 30-odd now. He's been on a one-year contract for virtually his whole career. And he was almost a fringe player when the Lions were no good. Yeah. Now he's a really valuable part of their defensive trio when they're like into a grand final. So he's improved massively, and they gave him the Jeremy Cameron matchup. And Jeremy snapped a couple of goals, but really never looked like marking the ball. Ryan Lester, he's been just an incredible improvement. But then you've got Starcevic, you've got Wilmot, you've got Answorth, of the more unheralded defenders that are really doing a good job for the Lions.
Wilmot's going to be a special player for a long time. He's hard to play on, he's quick, he's athletic, and now we're seeing, as this year's built on, because of the responsibility due to injuries, he's getting involved more and more in the attacking plays coming the other way.
And what about Oscar McInerney, Lee? What courage to come back on the field after dislocating his shoulder. He did it twice. He's not going to play the grand final. That's the news. But for him to even come back on at all shows exceptional bravery.
Absolutely. I mean, he's obviously dislocated his shoulder. We know that. So they popped the shoulder back in. You can imagine how sore he was. I guess they put a bit of elephant juice in there, Jimmy, to deaden the pain. And probably the fact that he was able to sort of get another 15 or 20 minutes out of himself, even though he's injured, even though he's in pain, allowed Joe Danaher to be more fresh when he had to do the ruck work so late in the game. So incredible courage to play with that kind of pain.
Also kept their sub, probably where you wanted to sub them, being McKenna, because of that extra 15, 20 minutes he was able to play. You didn't have to pull that early. And Lee, Darcy Fort, he's been spoken about as the obvious replacement. They've also got young Henry Smith, who's a big lug of a lad, but he's only played the 4 games.
You're not going with the kid.
You're
going to go with the experienced body. And Darcy Fort, he's a 31-year-old. Yeah. He's only played like a handful of games. He's been in the Lions 3. He was recruited to be the backup ruckman. And he's only been required on a handful of occasions. They've played him as a third tall player every now and again. So he hasn't played much footy, but he's just been there to replace Oscar McInerney. I don't think he's a perfect replacement because McInerney's quite a weapon. But
can he run with Brodie Grundy?
Yeah, he's an experienced, bulky ruckman who can keep his own in the push and shove against Brodie Grundy. So, again, that's really good list management. They recruited him 3 years ago almost to replace Oscar. If we need not replace him, but fill in for him if we need him. Well, I don't know whether anyone thought it was going to be a grand final, but Darcy Ford, he must have taken a big gulp halfway through the game because he would know he's the next in line.
And Dom Ambrosio has just put the pieces of this list together to a point now where they've been able to challenge for the last couple of years, in fact, play finals for a number of years now. Chris Fagan's done an exceptional job as well. We've talked about him this year, the care that he shows for his players. I just love how honest he was post-game on what they were doing wrong at the start of the year and then what he told his players to improve on it in the back half of the season.
You're the sum of all your experiences, and we're obviously disappointed about what happened in the grand final last year, as close as it was. And, you know, that was driving us coming into this season, but it was probably, in a way, driving us too hard. I felt like we were trying too hard. I think that sort of manifested itself in our kicking for goal as an example.
So that's Chris Fagan, who could be a premiership coach in 6 days' time.
That when you think, Jimmy, it's like, in other words, what he's saying is we played a bit stressed. Yep. You don't want to be playing anxious, and that's what he thought maybe was happening a little bit early in the year. You've got to be determined, but you've got to be careful that the stress is not jumping on your shoulders too.
And Lee, they kicked straight yesterday.
Makes a difference, doesn't it?
Makes a big
As we know with Geelong, with the Swans on Friday night. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Makes a big difference. And no one's talking about that US trip in the pre-season. It wasn't a story then. I still don't think it was a story now. Let's move on to Geelong Football Club. And the heat is clearly on them at the moment and their coach, Chris Scott, specifically around, and he was very honest post-game, talking about the selection calls that he found very difficult. Jimmy, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, because last week, this is not just hindsight. You believe the Cats should have selected Tom Hawkins. Shannon Neal was the 44th ranked player in the field for Champion Data. How significant was that selection call at match committee last week?
Well, hindsight's always perfect, isn't it?
But for you, it's not hindsight, though.
No, but that's just my opinion. And because probably I've got the relationship of having a long career with Tom Hawkins, so clearly I'm biased in that aspect. And I'd never played football with Shannon Neal, but I just had seen Tom Hawkins in too many big games off no real build-up, play good footy. And that's how I based my decision. They had pretty similar numbers this year. I just thought maybe Tom Hawkins would have probably posed a few more questions than a young Shannon Neal. Now, you can go back to when Hawkins replaced Mooney, but I thought Hawkins actually had games during that year, you know, as a bit of backup to make that decision over the top of Mooney going way back to 2011. But when you lose a game by pretty much a kick or, you know, a small margin, I think they went with the right one, but Brisbane was too good. But just, you're going to ask yourself, should I have gone to? Should I have maybe played De Koning as a ruck? Like, you can find plenty of the different things that you could have gone or should have, would have, could have. But me personally, I was always on the Hawkins bandwagon. Before we get your thoughts, Leigh, this was Chris Scott post-game.
I really don't like this part of the game. I found this week really hard dealing with those guys. And one of the hard parts is you come away from it and you still don't know whether it was the right decision or not. When it doesn't work out, you tend to think that maybe it wasn't. But I wasn't going to sleep for a couple of nights anyway, so...
Interesting comments by Chris, but really decision-making is what you do. You've got to make your decisions. I mean, you're going to who's 21st, who's 22nd, who's 23rd, who's 24th. So, I mean, the decision-making is part of it, and it's more difficult, I guess, when you've got an experienced player and a great player like Tom Hawkins, who you've got to sort of, as they decided that Shannon Neal would be a better option than Tom Hawkins. But whenever the decision doesn't work, then the hypotheticals come into it with you in yourself. I'm talking Chris Scott himself. Oh, did I do the right thing? Because there's no black and white in these things, but you make your decisions and you back your judgment.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really honest answer from Chris Scott as well. I mean, he'll be wrestling with that, I imagine, for a number of months, if not longer as well. And Tom Hawkins' career is finished as an all-time great of the Cats, regardless. Max Holmes could be an all-time great of the Cats in a few years' time, but his hamstrings seemed to have a few issues yesterday, just like it did a couple of years ago at a similar time of the year. This was an intriguing moment, Leigh, where they took 20 minutes to make this call to eventually sub him out.
I'm not worried about the 20 minutes. He was their weapon. I mean, when he was playing well, because he's their runner. I mean, Dangerfield can be, but couldn't get clear yesterday, but he's the one who can run and ball and break it up, get into space. So if I'm a coach, if you take 12, 13, 14, 15, try and get him on the field. When he's no good, tell me fine. But when he might be okay, I'd be persevering, I reckon.
And to highlight that, look at his first half numbers to the second half. He was one of the best 2 or 3 players on the ground. I guess the question came, Leigh, that it took so long to get him on, and then he tried it, and then they took him off. So you wonder, could they have just gone, right, he's not going back on, bring the sub on? But I'm with you, he was their 1 point of difference, especially through the midfield.
And it was a game of fine margins, as you mentioned as well. Tyson Stengel was goalless just for the 4th time this year, Jimmy.
Yeah, there's a few things that stood out, and Chris Scott touched on this when he elaborated further on the game, that they lost big moments and key decision-making things. And Geelong's built itself a reputation on team first. You go back to Cam Mooney, Steve Johnson about goal assists. Tom Hawkins, one of the great goal assist players. And I just think he played pretty selfish in the key moments, trying to take the hanger. That one should have gone straight to Dempsey. He was just off here. But I want to highlight this one, and this is not Geelong football. So the ball, Dane Zorko, great kick. Look at all the space that Bailey has in the middle of the ground. That is Tyson Stengel, who we're going to put a little thing on shortly, just there. And he just decides to walk away from it, doesn't even make a contest. Keeps walking. He and Jeremy Cameron are not communicating. Look who just goes past in the screen there. That's Zach Bailey. As we turn around the other way, there's no communication. He just strolls through inside forward 50, not a Cats player in sight. And look at that. When goals were so hard to come by in such a tense moment, I just thought that was pretty sloppy from Geelong and Tyson Stengel.
Chris Scott's given Tyson Stengel a lot of leeway this year. We know that. That's the Cats' way, and it's worked for Chris Scott in the past. Does that have anything to do with leeway on the field like that?
No. I think he's been fantastic. He's been one of the best small forwards. But now we're in a preliminary final. Every moment matters. And I said this about the Giants last week. Finals expose your warts. If you're slow in your decision-making, you're slow in your fundamentals, or you're not clean, you get ripped apart. Zach Bailey is a very good player. He shouldn't be able to jog from the centre of the ground all the way to 30 metres out when there's a goal in the game.
I'll ask you about Geelong's preparation, but Chris Fagan had an intriguing answer last night when he was quizzed on whether Brisbane or the Cats had a better lead into last night's prelim final.
If you look at their last game of the season against the West Coast, they were 100 points in front at half-time. It was a low-pressure, low contested game. Then they have a week off, and then they play Port in a final where it was a similar sort of game, low pressure, low contest game. Then they have another week off, and I just felt like it's good to have the time off, but you need the games that you play to be really hard, tough games. And maybe at the end that showed our harder preparation enabled us to run the game out.
Do you agree with that, Leigh?
Well, when you've got the bye after the home and away series now, when you go into the qualifying final, I think there's always the thought that the team that's played the 2 games, that is the elimination and then the semi-final, is sort of more ready to go than the qualifying winner who's now playing 1 time in a month, particularly as Chris pointed out, I was just thinking for the opposition, really. I mean, 2 gigantic wins in the last round against the Eagles and then Port. So they hadn't had a really hard contest for about 5 weeks. Anyway, so it's an interesting. I would have thought that's the problem about the bye after the home and away series is when you get to preliminary final weekend. I think quite possibly the team that's played the 2 games leading in is better than the team that's won the qualifying final, better prepared. And the big margins just accentuated that Geelong had a hard game for maybe 5 weeks.
And the Cats did have a difficult week as well with Stephen King on the training track.
Yeah.
I think it was on Friday. They had COVID and illness running through the club. Chris Scott didn't want to use it as an excuse, but that would clearly affect the way it was happening behind the scenes. They've got 11 30-plus-year-olds, Jimmy. I'm not going to start calling for a Cats cliff ever again because that cliff doesn't exist. Next year, they're going to have 8. If Gary Rowan plays on, they'll have 9, so they're going to be experienced again. There's no reason to think they can't challenge for a premiership in 2025.
No, I think people have made that mistake one too many times over the last 20 years, but they'll be hoping the likes of Clark and Bruin, who were top 10 picks, I know Bruin came via the Giants, one of them pop, to come into that midfield mix. Do they obviously land Bailey Smith and whoever else they're into? And plus, they're well drilled and well organised, the Cats. They're very strong behind the footy. What they do in the ruck, can Conway really step up and take the number 1 ruck role over Reece Stanley? So there's still plenty of talent there.
Welcome back to Footy Furnace. The Sydney Swans finished on top of the ladder for a reason. They won their prelim final by 6 goals. Jimmy, how did they do it?
Nice and slick ball movement. It was nice to get that game if you're playing a preliminary final. It was pretty bruise-free, and if you're allowed to take 117 uncontested marks, and with the skill set of the Swans, you're going to cut the opposition apart, and that's why they were so ruthlessly efficient. Their ability to match Port Adelaide in that midfield contest, but then they just had their way after it. Once they got the ball back, they didn't give it back. They could pick and choose. Look at that contest. Take the free. Port Adelaide player 25 metres off the mark there, just being an escort or a caravan coming up and then just manning the mark. And now it's just pick your target. Keep coming at the kicker because we know if you come at the kicker, Leigh loves to drop off. Look at this, another contest. You're good enough in the contest to match it. Great, strong tackling. But then good things come off the back of it because they're outnumbered and spread. And Sydney's got this ability that they can either run away from the contest or they can kick their way from it because obviously they've got the running dynamic power. We think of Heaney and Warner, but then they've got the kickers of Blakey, Roberts. Florent was magnificent with his ball use. Look at that spread. As soon as turnover, where's the Port Adelaide player? There he is, just jogging up, 25 metres off it. Next Port Adelaide player, 15 metres off the play there. That sort of training drill sort of stuff. You love that if you're going into a preliminary final because you're not going to get hurt going into a granny.
They were outstanding. I thought it started with the back third, though, of the Swans, McCartan, Malik and Rampy. I mean, they just kept marking the ball and Florent and those guys, Cunningham, would bounce it out. So when you turn the ball over in the back 50 and all of a sudden they went to the wings and they ran hard and they just held it together. And I think McInerney and Florent played well last Friday night when, McInerney's been injured a bit lately and Florent has been a bit off the ball. So most Swans players had really good, are now going into the grand final having a good game or two behind them.
Yeah, Rampy was magnificent. You throw in Cunningham, who he almost puts the small forwards on an island. He makes it pretty deserted there for small forwards. He did a fantastic job on Rioli. But this is what I love. He's playing on Rioli, probably the most damaging and dangerous player for Port Adelaide. He's up there on the half-forward line, driving the ball inside forward 50. So they play both sides of the ball really well, their defenders. They take the opposition's player first, and then they attack off the back of that.
What did you make about the battle in the air, the tools from both sides, Leigh?
I guess when you go in, both sides, no All-Australians in the key forwards of the two teams at this point in time. You had Amati and McLean, of course, and McDonald. And then you had Dixon, who's maybe used to be an All-Australian, but not now, and Radigali and Georgiades. And the Swans guys took 23 marks, kicked 6 goals between them. And the trio from Port, I think 8 marks, a couple of goals. Yeah. So in terms of the output of your key tools, Swans much better.
They've got to work out what they're going to do with Radigali next year. Like, is he actually a defender or are you going to train him as a forward? Because his last 8 games when he went forward, he kicked 3 goals. He was goalless in the last 6 and only averaged 2 marks a game. So,
what would you do if you were the Port coach?
Well, I think they've got to embrace a new style of football because they've got a great territory game. But what keeps showing up in finals, if the opposition can match their midfield in around the contest, they've been scored on.
But what do you do? I mean, he'd be on a 3-year contract, right? So it's not as if you're going to...
It's longer than that.
But at the moment, they found that he wasn't agile enough to be part of their defensive group, with Zirk Thatcher particularly. Yeah. So they put him up forward. He's done very little up forward. I mean, unless he finds another gear, he's just out of the team. Forget about these.
$700,000-800,000 a year.
You're not going to pay him just because he's well paid.
You can't be a key forward.
They might have a problem. What can they do with him that gets value?
Yeah, he can't be a key forward and go 6 games without a goal and only 2 marks.
No, I'm with you completely. So he's a defender then, but if there's no room,
you're
trading him.
He's not a defender. Well, or trade him if they could. But at the moment, on his first 12 months at Port, it hasn't worked.
Yeah.
Yep.
Callum Mills, this is probably the biggest pure footy story for the weekly. If you're the Sydney Swans coach, John Longmire, are you playing him in the grand final?
Well, if he's at his best, if you think he's at his best and he's fit. And one thing I would think with that hamstring-related stuff, you'd want to have a couple of training sessions under your belt. Like,
He's had two. He trained Friday and he trained today.
He'd have to feel like he's going flat out on Tuesday and then flat out again on Thursday to be even considered. And then it's just as all those selection decisions are. I mean, if he's fit and well and at his best, yeah, he's in their best team. But he hasn't been great in his last couple of months since he's come back from injury. So I don't think it's any lay down misère. No. You'd have to be really confident he's ready to go.
It's a brave coach that leaves out its captain, even though that he's fully fit.
That's happened before.
But John Longmire...
For a grand final?
I reckon way back, this is a long time, back in about 1980, I thought Bruce Monteith and Richmond or something.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure whether I'm not sure whether there was a captain left out, but that's a long time ago.
Yeah, okay.
It'd be 17 days to the grand final since he hurt his hamstring. And with Leigh, the only way to test hamstrings is to hit top speed repeatedly.
Are you playing him?
If he's fit.
You're playing him. John Longmire, I want to talk about his legacy because I think it's a massive week for him in terms of his legacy. We know that it's his 5th grand final this year, the same number as you. You won 4, Leigh, as a coach. From modern-day great coaches, he needs to win a second flag to frank his legacy. And the Swans are playing good enough footy to do so. If you look at John Longmire's career, he's been an amazing coach. But I think, Leigh, to be an all-time great coach, he needs 2 flags.
Well, it is interesting, isn't it, really? I'm more into win-loss ratios over a long career. I mean, Chris Scott's in the high 60s, like he's just, and John Longmire's just in the about 60-odd, which is fantastic as coaches go, long-term coaches go. But really, the coaches tend to just get remembered by the premierships they coached.
Yeah.
Unfair, but that just tends to be what history tends to judge the most. So at the moment, he's won 3, and you go to 1-4. But if you go to a couple, along the way. But it's only one game, but it's so critical for a coach and a team, clearly, whether you win or lose.
Yeah, people remember premiership coaches. Yeah. People don't remember premiership percentages quite as much, Leigh. Yeah. Let's move on to Port Adelaide, who, of course, got done against the Swans the other night. And it was a performance that probably left a little bit lacking on the field. But the Ken Hinkley era is one that I want to talk about. But before we talk about him specifically, this was the Port coach after the game.
I have been the constant, along with some other people at the footy club, but it's not a one person. Like we should stop that story a little bit. This is a whole of club thing that goes on. It's not one person responsible. If we had got through tonight, it wouldn't have been me. And if we didn't get through tonight, it'd be us.
I think if you actually look at their list, Jimmy and Leigh, they've actually overachieved this season. They don't look like a prelim final list to me, even though they finished second on the ladder. I don't know how you guys see it.
Yeah, for one reason, I've never been up near the top most of the year, but I've never thought they were a premiership threat for some reason. But they're one game off getting into a grand final. So I don't know whether it's just history has warned us that in the last week or two they're found wanting, which I guess is largely what has transpired over this last period.
How do you see Port and Ken Hinkley more specifically, Jimmy?
Well, on Port, we just raised questions about what they do forward and back. Obviously, Houston, where does he go? Farrell was a big out. So we've just described in front of the footy what their options have been, behind the footy what their options, and teams go to work. If they can match Port Adelaide in the midfield, they get good results. So they've been beaten convincingly in 2 finals. So
Ken Hinkley's got 1 year left on a contract, and that's his record in finals. I mean, it's better than a lot of coaches, but nevertheless, he hasn't made a grand final yet. Look, Josh Carr will be Port's next coach. It's just a matter of when that will happen. Port Adelaide likes its program. It doesn't see a reason to bring in someone else to be a senior coach when Josh Carr's already there. And as it sits, we expect Ken Hinkley to be there next year. But there are people that are close to Ken Hinkley that wouldn't be hugely shocked if he walked away now, which I was surprised when I learnt that in the last 24 hours. I'm not saying he will. I'm just saying that it wouldn't be a massive shock, such as the toll that the last few months has taken on the senior coach. And the central question in all this, I think, Leigh, is he happy to ride it out in 2025 without a contract for 2026? That's the big question for Ken, given how arduous this season's been.
Well, he's done it before, really, and that's probably what should happen. And to be honest, there should be more clubs that let their coach go into the last year of the contract. Not many clubs want to do that. But one thing I will say, I don't think there's any difference between a coach who can get his team from preliminary final to grand final or win a premiership. Like, it's not as if there's this golden magic bullet. Some teams are good enough and the coach gets the credit for it. And that's what Ken Hinkley's saying. It's a group of people now that coordinate the playing group, coordinate the list management. And right at the moment, the main thing at Port, we've got to get a better list together. I wouldn't think in any case or shape or form is Ken Hinkley unable to take a club to the next step.